by the desire to know and obey him. Where have you heard that theme before? The four cardinal virtues of Stoic philosophy were wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Virtue alone was sufficient for happiness. A sage was immune to misfortune because he is dispassionate about all things, both good and evil. Epictetus has this quote, "Sick and yet happy, in peril and yet happy, dying and yet happy, in exile and yet happy, in disgrace and yet happy." Now, you Bible scholars should be able to key in on this very similarity in 2 Corinthians 4, 8, and 9.
Persecuted, but not.
We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed. This is Paul echoing Stoic thought. A sage achieved freedom by studying and seeking universal reason, and that universal reason was their logos concept, and a practicing asceticism. Notice, now we have the correlation that not only is it necessary to study this higher mystical concept, but it is specifically essential that the flesh is purged in the process. The flesh is beaten and the study continues. Do you see this relationship? Those who practice these virtues are enlightened and can achieve freedom from the vicious materialism and emotionalism of this world. Stoics were determinists. They said that everything is subject to the laws of fate. The logos acts in accord with its own nature and governs matter. Souls are emanations from the logos and are therefore subject to logos dictates, hence their determinism. They described the wicked man like this: he is like a dog tied to a cart and compelled to go wherever it goes. For you history buffs, you will recognize this from the Christian deterministic traditions that describes man like this: man is on the back of the horse being led around by the devil. This is Reformed Theology 101. I do want to make a comment about logos. Heraclitus was the first to use the term. Aristotle used it to mean reasoned discourse. However, the Stoics were the first to use the Greek word logos in conjunction with God. They said that the logos was the animating force of the universe. It was this conceptual and linguistic shift that made the introductory chapter of the Gospel of John possible. Of course, later Christianity condemned Stoicism, but that didn't stop them from using Stoic concepts, logos, virtue, spirit, and conscience, and advocating the primary themes of Stoic metaphysics and ethics: an inner freedom in spite of worldly hardships, the innate depravity of man, called persistent evil by the Stoics, the futility and temporal nature of worldly possessions and attachments. And here are my last comments about these two groups. I want to illustrate how the Pythagoreans' soul-body dichotomy weaved its path from their relatively hedonistic cynic, from their relative, for heaven's sake, John, from their relative hedonism to the cynic doctrines and the Stoic doctrines in front of us. The transition from their general mind-body dichotomy to now man must use violence against his own body to achieve enlightenment. And just so you understand, when we start talking about asceticism, we're not talking about giving up a few apple pies for McDonald's. The asceticism that I'm talking about, the asceticism that became the dominant theme, the accepted expression of virtue, we're now talking about beating the flesh, violence toward the flesh as an ethical ideal. What came next from effectively from roughly 250 AD all the way into about 1100? Here's what these people did. They sat on stone pillars until their legs rotted away. They drank laundry water. They slept on beds of nails. They inflicted on themselves personal and or public floggings for sins. Martin Luther is said to have beat himself. This became an ethical ideal. This is the corruption implicit to these ideas. When you so divide man from reality, when you so divide man from life, you can only worship death. And that's exactly where these doctrines trend. Okay, my closing remarks. I do want to make a couple comments because I think Susan is going to probably talk about this. I want to point your attention to Plotinus I do want you to notice, now I want you to get this. See where Christianity is on this timeline? This is roughly about 100 years. This is Christianity's move into the Hellenistic world. Okay? One of the reasons you see such a huge disconnect between Old and New Testament is because the Old Testament had none of these preoccupations. It had no knowledge, no particular knowledge of this information. The information that they were concerned with had an entirely different worldview. Christianity shows up, and we don't actually start getting our text from Christianity until probably about 70 AD. Depending on when you start dating. And the early stuff that we have, like say what is called Q, the Q document, which is the precursor to Mark, that doesn't really show up until probably 30 AD. So we have already started to move deep into this. And you see, when you see the fight between Peter and Paul, you see Peter utterly mystified by Paul's concerns, and in specific the Gentile access to the covenants of promise. Peter is still very much a Jew in his head. He's still very much translating the world from the Judaic perspective. And of course we know ultimately Peter changes his mind, but this collision of ideas is catastrophic. By the time we get to the Gospel of John, probably dating right around 70 to 80 AD, we have a full disconnect. We have the preamble of the Gospel of John, which is absolutely a Hellenistic document. And that has been actually cut into a broader tradition. And we have an absolute split between Jews and Christians.
Can you reiterate the Peter and Paul dispute again? I'm embarrassed to ask this, but can you reiterate what that was about again?
The primary dispute, well, we have a couple of different disputes, but the leading one was you have Peter still believing in the covenants of promise. And access to the covenants of promise is by circumcision. You understand that, right?
Right, that's right.
So, and once you're circumcised, now mind you, I've made this comment on my blog a few times and it usually gets people riled up, but legalism is a Paul concept. Jews weren't legalistic. Jews are observant. They don't consider their diligence to observance to be a bad thing. Paul took that and turned it into a vice for his own particular arguments later. So you have Peter being observant. Peter is observing the law. He is being diligent with the law. And the big problem, and for heaven's sake, how much? Yeah, I'll tell you anyway. Okay. The problem with Judaism is that it was temple-centric. To practice the law, you had to be very close to the temple. Without a temple, you had a lot of problems with what they considered to be uncleanness. A whole series of subsets of practices that they couldn't actually achieve without the temple. Now, of course, you roll through Jesus' life and he's all fussed. He's really upset about the fact that his house has become a house of merchandise. But the problem is that the only way the Jews could practice their Judaism was to basically take a trip, sell their stuff, take a trip, get to the temple, buy their sacrifices, be observant of their Judaism, and then return home. So the merchandising of the temple practice was directly related to the impossibility of the way the law was constructed. So here's Peter. He's still a very good Jew in his head. He's still being observant, and he's still being faithful to the covenants of promise. Now, mind you, most Christians really have no conception of what I'm talking about when I talk about covenants of promise. Because for most Christians, the gospel has become Jesus Christ and Him crucified. That was not the gospel. The gospel was specifically that Jesus was specifically the manifestation, the ultimate manifestation of access to the covenants of promise. His life was to give everybody the same access to Abraham's blessing in the contemporary age. That's what Jesus preached. So here's Peter saying to all the Christians, no, if you're going to become a Christian, we're still keeping the covenants of promise. So you must be circumcised and then be observant of the law. Paul comes along and says, no, that can't be true. How can circumcision be the important part? Paul has an entire theology on that. Bang, they fight. The fight that they had, and I don't remember where the source was, it's my understanding that it was violent. They fought. But, I don't know, doesn't matter. the thing that I find interesting is that there really was no resolution to this. Ultimately, what Paul decides is, I tell you what, guys, just call me an apostle, I'll pay you money, and I'll go do my thing someplace else. That's pretty much the resolution. They really never resolved the fight. Now, eventually, Peter realizes that access to the covenants of promise is not there. The Gentiles aren't unclean. They actually are allowed to have access to the covenants of promise by virtue of the revelations that he gets, the visions that he gets. But the specific fight between Paul and Peter never really resolves. That's not how it works. So that was the fight that I was talking about. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So now we have Paul venturing out into the Hellenistic world. His problem, his problem is trying to reconcile Christianity, this little sect right here, with all of this. This is his intellectual problem. Now, he has to his advantage what is called the diaspora Jews. So the diaspora Jews were the dispersion of Jews that had been gone abroad and basically collectivized in their little own enclaves and other basically Roman cities. And so Paul is able to go to these Jewish cities, and he has two common backgrounds. He has the Jewishness, their Jewish heritage, their observance of law, their observance of Torah, and he also has the ability now to start talking about all of this. And he starts to integrate the Stoics, the Cynics, and basically taking their argumentative conventions and tailoring them to his own ends. And this is how we end up with what is predominantly what comes after pretty much the whole of his thought and a number of other documents. So that, I'm not sure I remember why I headed down that path. Oh, that was the challenge. So this is how the Christianity expands into the Hellenistic world. Now notice you have a resurgent Pythagorean movement, sophists, and another Pythagorean movement. This is how much it dominated. This is how much these ideas kept showing up and showing up and showing up. Now it's right here at Plotinus. This is the guy that makes Augustine possible. Plotinus, he was a Neoplatonist. He has nothing to offer philosophically. He makes no adjustments at all. All he does is reintroduce Platonist ideas. Now mind you, notice Platon is way back here. So we're talking almost 600 years has passed. We don't have the internet. So these guys are rediscovering, this is a major discovery. And so he actually shows up and hits his information that ultimately impacts Augustine. Now I want to say this. You do have Philo. Philo, Judaism knew it had some problems, and it had always been largely xenophobic, which meant it didn't like outside influences. And so it was always going to be this backwater, backwoods religion, this really strange monotheistic religion out in the backside of nowhere. And Philo comes along and says, wait a minute, we're not that crazy. Really and truly, here is our religion. Oh, by the way, here's Plato. And by the way, it actually makes a pretty good merge. And so Philo is already trying to merge Platonism, and I think Philo shows up about... Do you remember? Do you remember? I don't remember. He shows up, Philo is in here somewhere. I don't remember off the top of my head, but he is still in that progression. So it wasn't, Plotinus is not an aberration, and Augustine is not an aberration. Augustine just takes it to the nth degree. Does that make sense? Now, do you have the scope of this issue? You get it? See it? You dazed? Mm-hmm. Yeah? So the next time you hear a Calvinist start thumping the pulpit that they're the only theological game in town, laugh. Not even close. They're almost not a blip on the map. And they are only the logical conclusions that start from here. This is where it starts. This is where it gets its formal expression. Platonism here is what produces everything that comes after.
And that's what they say plainly.
Oh, well, they should say it plainly. That would be the truth.
Yeah, and they do. They admit it. They're not the least bit shy about calling Augustine the father of the Reformation. Okay.
I don't know. I'm not sure I've ever heard them admit the philosophical roots from the ancient Greeks. They may say Augustine.
Hit me slide 15, please.
But I think they just think of it as good old-fashioned biblical sound.
Yeah, it's just doctrine.
Real, it's doing church right. It's Christianity right.
Correct. That's exactly how they think of it.
It's the divine revealed truth.
Correct. 15. I do want to do this summary. I want this in your heads.
Well, we have a myriad of quotations down in the office.
I'm
Where,
sure you do, and I know you'll prove me wrong.
Vance's book
Yeah,
on this issue
Yeah.
is like that thick.
I know you'll get me on
Yeah,
that one. Your
so-
research is
Here we go.
very
Okay,
precise.
this is my last. This is my last series of comments. I wanted.
Is it on the right one?
It should be no, the next one. There should be one more. This one. This one's hard to read. Basically, what I've done here is I've extracted the common themes from the beginning. The Pythagoreans. This is before. Now, mind you, this is before Christianity shows up. This is the intellectual frame of reference before we ever get on the map with Jesus. All right. The Pythagoreans, the soul-body dichotomy, matter is evil, body is evil. Only those who are initiated into the mysteries can know the truth. The atomist, two worlds. This world is evil and imperfect. Determinism. The sophists, skepticism, senses plus reason are corrupt. Truth is impossible. The cynics and stoics, enlightenment is reserved for another dimension. A transcendent salvation from the logos after purification. And asceticism, hatred for the flesh manifest into action, brought to the highest ethical action. Plato integrates all of this into a comprehensive philosophy. And his conclusion was that the only correct form of government was totalitarian collectivism, totalitarian communism. Once you understand how many root doctrines have influenced us, it absolutely changes the face of Christianity. Now, you're going to have to come up with a conclusion. Either you're going to accept syncretism, in other words, the merging of non-biblical pagan sources into the truth, or you're going to have to reject these at the root. And that's what you're confronted with. I'll let you ponder what that means. Thank you.
I told you it would be a master's level Greek philosophy class.
How long before you come up?
I'm supposed to go next whenever you
You're
point
supposed
at
to
me.
come up next.
Is there room
And
on the camera?
Puerto Rico's back.
With popcorn.
David's eating popcorn.
Are you eating ice cream?
We never went anywhere.
We've been here the whole time.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, do you want to, Philip's going to have to reset the cameras and you'll be good to go then.
So I'm going to do both of them?
Hmm?
I'll do both of them.
Yeah,
All right, you all
5
better
minutes.
stand up. Your bottoms are going